Green means it's live.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Tap it. Just tap it.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. How you doing? You ready for some philosophy? Always. Well, I'm Professor Nick Bucola. I teach in the Department of Political Science here at Linfield. I'm excited to welcome you to this event. This is the, I don't know what number in a series of events we've been doing this semester with the kind of why X matters as kind of our organizing theme. You started out back in February. Many of you were here for John Lysaker talking about friendship. And then we had a series of virtual events with really focused on American political thought. So some of you have been part of that. And today we are very lucky to have Professor Myisha Cherry with us to talk about Audre Lorde and get us thinking about some of the many reasons why Audre Lorde matters. I want to say a couple thank yous before I introduce Myisha. This event is being sponsored by the Frederick Douglass Forum on Law, Rights, and Justice. I kind of realized belatedly that I think the Douglass Forum is celebrating its 10th birthday, at least, which is something else. So way back when, actually just, 25 yards, right over there by that fireplace, we had the first official Douglass Forum event with Professor James Miller talking about examined lives. I think he talked about Montaigne, and I can't remember who the other philosopher he talked about. But here we are, all these years later, with another philosopher here to talk about important things. So dozens of scholars and scholar events and also events featuring students speaking over the years. So it's pretty cool to think about how far we've traveled together. And so I want to say a couple thank yous related to the folks who make the Douglass Forum possible. Sheila Oster is one of our benefactors, both in the Douglass Forum and in the Political Science Department. Sheila and her husband Michael established the Elliot Alexander Fund for Political Science to honor the memory of their son Elliot, who was a student here at Linfield who passed away, who loved coming to events like this. He loved to have philosophical conversations, so I'm always grateful to Sheila and Michael for establishing that fund and empowering us to do things like this. I also want to thank the EMS crew. We're live streaming right now, so not only do we have all of you here, but we have the millions of people on YouTube who are tuned in to watch this lecture. And so I'm grateful to the EMS crew for making that possible. Amy Scholler, who I saw somewhere running around back there, Amy has been so helpful in getting the logistics organized for this, and I'm so grateful to Amy. I see Connie over there. Thank you, Connie, and the catering team. We're going to have some snacks and reception afterwards and some conversation. One of the things I really appreciate about reading so much Lorde those last couple weeks is all these wonderful descriptions of meals with others and engaging in philosophical conversation over vodka, or, we don't have vodka, I don't think, but we'll see. Maybe you brought your own vodka. You could slip it in your lemonade. No, I didn't say that. I'm on YouTube. Oh, God. Anyway, enough about all that. If I'm forgetting any other thank yous, please, I apologize now. Let me tell you a little bit about Myisha. I think I've been talking about Myisha a lot for the last few weeks, so many of you are tired of hearing me sing Myisha's praises, but Myisha is one of my favorite people. I met Myisha at a conference many years ago, and I just knew, I said, I do this a lot. I'm like, I want that person to be my friend. I advise all you students, if you find somebody you admire, just say I'm going to try to make that person my friend. Don't be weird about it, but just go tell them you admire their work and you want to be their friend. Myisha is one of those people. So I've been lucky to know Myisha for a few years. And Myisha is engaged in philosophy in many different ways. And one of the things I really admire about what Myisha does is she really is devoted to this idea of public philosophy. So Myisha has an amazing podcast you should check out. Unmute is the name of the podcast. Unmuted is the name of the collection of transcripts of some of the conversations that Myisha has had with a wide range of folks about a variety of different things. So I've been listening to it. I told her I've been binging Unmute podcast. This morning I was getting some exercise. I listened to a conversation about existentialism and romantic love. You can learn about epistemology. You can learn about moral progress. All these really, really great conversations that Myisha has had through the Unmute podcast. And also, Myisha is engaged in philosophy in the old-fashioned way through books. I have here The Case for Rage, which is going to come up in some ways with our topic today, Why Anger is Essential to Anti-Racist Struggle, from Oxford University Press. And the next book is coming out in September and is from Princeton University Press. You can see Myisha is kind of an underachiever, Oxford, Princeton. That book is called Failures of Forgiveness, What We Get Wrong and How to Do Better. The other thing that's really cool, and this is going to be part of our amazing applause we're about to have for Myisha, is that like Myisha's got all these books and done all these things, but just yesterday, the University of California at Riverside, where Myisha teaches philosophy, granted her tenure, which I just thought she did. So, which is sort of like anticlimactic because it wasn't like there was no suspense about whether Myisha would get tenure, but it's still really cool. And, so I'm just so honored to have Myisha here at Linfield with us to talk about Audre Lorde. So without further ado, Myisha.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that introduction. As Nick was introducing me, and he said, well, I met Myisha a few years ago. He didn't tell you the full story of that, because fast forward 5 years from that allegedly first meeting, I go up to Nick, and it was like, Nick, we've been Facebook friends forever. This is our first time meeting. And then Nick says, no, it's not. We met 5 years ago, and I totally still do not have any recollection of that meeting. But which just makes me feel awful. I just appreciate him and his scholarship so much. And I just loved his Buckley and Baldwin book, and it's just, I'm still singing his praises. And anytime he asked me to do something, 98% of the time, I'm going to say yes. So I was just excited to accept his invitation to be with you all, and to be with him, and to be with you all, and to be with him, to discuss Audre Lorde and anger. So some of you all have been reading some of Audre Lorde's work via Nick, and you all perhaps have come to the same conclusion that I have, that she was a brilliant poet and a scholar. And her writings on race, sexism, and emotions, in my view, offer insight into what keeps us bound despite our best efforts. Yet, her accusatory verse and her prose do not simply leave us stuck in shame. Rather, they allow us to envision a better future, and they move us to engage in action in order to shape a new world. Adamant that she didn't write theory, Lorde instead chose to embrace poet as her literary title. But despite Lorde's own thoughts, Nancy Barrino, the original editor of Lorde's essay collection, Sister Outsider, was right to conclude that, quote, Lorde's voice is central to the development of contemporary feminist theory. She is at the cutting edge of consciousness, end quote. Now, I experienced such thinking upon my first reading of her essay, The Uses of Anger. And I read it for the first time in 2012, or discovered it for the first time in 2012 while I was reading philosophy journals, particularly articles about emotions. And I noticed that feminist philosophers were taking Lorde seriously as a theorist, and they were drawing inspiration from her argument that anger was epistemically and practically useful, particularly in a patriarchal society that teaches women not to be angry and punishes them when they express rage. And in the essay, Lorde defends anger's role in the fight against racism from a feminist perspective. However, as I dug deeper into Lorde's work, I discovered another essay on anger, an essay entitled Eye to Eye, Black Women, Hatred, and Anger. And this was written 2 years later after Uses of Anger. Yet, this essay, I noticed, was rarely being taken up by feminist philosophers. Even the collection, I think Nick showed me the Roxane Gay collection, and you notice the first section is dedicated to her prose, and out of all the essays that are mentioned, she does not include Eye to Eye in that collection. So one might wonder why that's the case. So I think perhaps this has to do with audience. She wrote Uses of Anger to address racism in predominantly white feminist circles, and thus, she originally conceived of it as a speech addressed to a white audience. Lorde wrote the essay Eye to Eye to address self-hatred among black women, and thus its first appearance appears in Essence magazine, which is a black woman's publication. So it therefore makes sense why white feminist philosophers, who are the majority in academic feminist philosophy, would stay away from Eye to Eye, with the assumption that there is perhaps an inside conversation occurring, one that may not be none of their business. And perhaps Roxane Gay also didn't include that essay because, hey, this is none of some people's business. Now, today, however, I want to trouble this assumption, and I want to argue that what Lorde has to say in the essay is important to our overall understanding of anger and oppression. And I also think that analyzing the essay will help us address three important philosophical and politically practical questions. That is, one, what is the relationship between hatred and anger? Two, how does a person like Lorde go from a defense of anger to a criticism of it? And three, what does the essay reveal about anger and anti-racist struggle despite its particularity? Okay, let's get going. So we are not to assume that writers are always passionate about their subjects. It's getting close to final, so you all understand what that means. Often, it is the solution that drives them despite the ugliness of the matter under discussion. Now, Audre Lorde admitted that she did not enjoy talking about hatred. However, her work reveals that her thinking about the topic was quite sophisticated, and her answers for how to escape its trappings were practical and distinct from normative suggestions that she offers up in her previous essays. Now, Lorde defines hatred as, quote, that societal death wish directed against us, black women, from the moment that we were born black and female in America. It is a death wish for the hated. And it's here that her account squares with recent work in social psychology that describes the action tendency of hatred as wishing for the elimination of the other. And to illustrate this death wish and ill will aspect of hatred, Lorde cites historical examples. She mentions Elizabeth Efford of Little Rock, Arkansas. And in describing her day of integrating a Southern school in the 1950s, Lorde depicts the white verbal opposition she experienced as, quote, white hatred running down Efford's pink sweater and a white mother's twisted mouth, savage, inhumane, wide over Efford's jaunty braids, held high by their pink ribbons, end quote. And she then references an example of a physical death wish born of hate when she mentions 4 little black girls, no more than 10 years of age, singing their last autumn song in a Sunday school in Birmingham, Alabama, a reference to the 16th Street Baptist Church bombings that killed 4 black girls and injured 22 others. However, Lorde doesn't restrict hatred to ill will. In her view, hatred also refers to what she calls an emotional habit or attitude in which aversion is coupled with ill will. It's ill will plus aversion or disgust. Disgust, directed toward others, derives from our human inclination for primitive disgust. And primitive disgust is our natural reaction to such triggers as smelly and decaying things. It creates a yuck reaction in us and is thought to originate from our biological tendency to protect ourselves from infections. But the aversion that Lorde speaks of is social disgust. With social disgust, instead of insects, we show an aversion towards others because we associate them with the repulsive. Lorde provides an example of this aversion aspect of hate when she recounts a childhood experience on the subway. She writes, on the other side, a white woman in her fur hat staring at me. Her mouth twitches as she stares and her gaze drops down, pulling mine with it. Her leather-gloved hand plucks at the line where my new blue snow pants and her sleek fur coat meet. She jerks her coat closer to her. I look. I do not see whatever terrible thing she is seeing on the seat between us, probably a roach. She has communicated her horror at me. It must be something very bad from the way she's looking. So I pull my snowsuit closer to me, away from it, too. When I look up, the woman is still staring at me, her nose, holes, and eyes huge. And suddenly I realize that it is nothing crawling up the seat between us. It is me she doesn't want her coat to touch. I do not understand, but I will never forget it. Her eyes, the flared nostrils, the hate. Lorde first assumes that the woman is expressing primitive disgust at an insect. She soon realizes that she, a black girl, is the object of the white woman's disgust. It is social disgust. But even that description is incomplete. Lorde labels it as hate. However, ill will and disgust are not the only attitudes involved in hatred. Lorde also includes loathing and contempt for whatever is black and female. Now, contempt is what we refer to as an other blame emotion, and it responds to violations of community norms. So this leads one to ask, what crimes could black women and girls have committed to make them targets of contempt? If contempt is a violation of community norms, and it has to do with social hierarchies, and if according to Lorde, we live in a patriarchal and sexist society, then black women will be violators of community norms that says that they do not belong or hold a status worth considering. And they will be apt targets of contempt as a result. And it's for this reason that when Lorde attempts to give a reason for why black women are targets of hate, she says, from that moment on, we have been seeped in hatred for our color, for our sex, for our effrontery and daring to presume we had any right to live. If apt contempt responds to bad being, that is, bad character, then contempt found in hatred towards black women responds to their bad being in another sense. It's their very existence that is considered a moral wrong. It was the source of this bad being that Lorde tried to rid herself up as a child via bathing. She writes, did bad mean black? The endless scrubbing with lemon juice in the cracks and crevices of my ripening, darkening body. And oh, the sins of my dark elbows and knees, my gums and nipples, the folds of my neck and the cave of my armpits. Black women's crime is their existence and their belief that they deserve to be alive. In a sexist and racist society, such existence will make them apt targets of contempt and thus hatred. Lorde not only defines hatred, but provides two types of it, racism and sexism, and she suggests that both are correctly perceived as hatred. Hatred's function is quite clear for Lorde. For her, it operates certainly to mask and distort the beauty, which is power in ourselves. The hate functions to delimit black women's power, a power that Lorde sought to amplify to and activate in her readers. And while Lorde admits that outside hateful structures have created barriers to delimit black women's power, she thinks that a different manifestation of hatred has much more potential to threaten black women's power and their survival. Now, if you are the target of hate in a society filled with misogyny, what are the psychological attitudes and social acts that one is likely to take on and engage? For Lorde, it is self-hatred. And self-hatred leads to a distinct kind of anger and cruelty. Now, before we get to these latter effects, it's important to address how, according to Lorde, self-hatred arises. First, Lorde believes that a constant diet of hatred leaves the hated agent wanting to become anything but themselves. This begins in childhood, for as Lorde writes, quote, little black girls tutored by hate into wanting to become anything else, end quote. And this helps explains Lorde's attempt to scrub the blackness off of her body as a child. Her self-hatred makes her not want to be who she is. She yearns and works to become anything else but a black girl. Second, and most importantly for Lorde, Self-hatred leads the hated agent to hate those who most resemble herself, other black women. Now, there are several reasons why other black women are targets. One reason is related to what I refer to as myth confirmation. Now, if there is a mythology that exists about a racial group and one internalizes it, an encounter with another person of the same group can remind or amplify the truth of the myth, and hence the alleged truth about oneself. Lorde thinks that other black women are the targets of self-hatred because their presence is the very embodiment of white mythology, and thereby yells out what is well known about black women and their status in society. Seeing another black woman confirms a well-known secret that black women, including oneself, are apt targets of disgust, contempt, and ill will. Lorde states, quote, "We cut our eyes at sister because she can only reflect what everybody except mama seemed to know, that we were hateful or ugly or worthless, but certainly unblessed. We were not boys and we were not white, so we counted for less than nothing except to our mamas." And it's here that the contemptuous aspect of hate appears. Black women are the targets of the self-hatred not only because they can remind each other of the myth, but because they can reflect the hated agent. For Lorde, we bear the face that hatred seeks. The other black woman is indeed like her, and if you hate yourself, you will likely hate those who most resemble you. Lorde describes it as such, for once she, quote, "takes the white world's estimation as black women synonymous with garbage to heart, then deep inside, she will always believe that she is truly good for nothing, and it is easy to see you as good for nothing because you are like me." Here we see that other black women's bad being is a reflection of one's own bad being. This self-hatred would not only create psychological struggles, but produce effects that reify the claims of white supremacy and halt the necessary love needed to reclaim black women's power under oppression. For Lorde, anger becomes the vehicle that brings about these destructive results. Now, it must be noted that such claims are not meant to pathologize black women. To be sure, if anything is pathological, it is the conditions that give rise to anger. It is the pathological context that engenders black women's anger. For as Bell Hooks declares, quote, "White supremacy is rooted in pathological responses to difference." A society that hates black women ever since they were born simply because they insist on the right to exist is indeed pathological. In addition, Lorde held an inclusive and expansive perspective concerning oppression and its effects. Misuse and anger, it's not just a vulnerability that black women face. For Lorde and her essay Uses of Anger exposes the distinct problems that angry white feminists also face in response to their own racism and mistreatment of black feminist allies. What I believe that she is pointing to, with black women as a case study, is the mechanisms and outcomes involved when any group of people are the targets of societal hate. Though there will be differences, hatred, and thus hatred, self-hatred, will exist among the oppressed. Her diagnosis is not just exclusive to the black women experience. I believe that it is a message for us all. So Lorde acknowledges that when you are a target of consistent hatred as expressed in misogynoir, and you internalize the hatred, there would be destructive effects in your interactions with other black women for the reasons expressed. Growing up, metabolizing hatred makes it the case that every human interaction, according to Lorde, becomes tainted with the negative passion and intensity of its byproducts, anger and cruelty. This cruelty is part of the legacy of hate. The anger is armed with a powerful cruelty learned in the bleakness of too early battles for survival, says Lorde. Now, one might say that this harshness is part adaptive. It can help the hated agent to survive in a hostile world. And that's why Lord says, to adapt and take the hate, we become like stone. However, it's also non-adaptive. For the drawback is that, according to Lord, you end up bruising those closest to you, those you need in order to survive. The idea that harshness can protect you forever, and Lord calls this the myth of self-protection, in her words, breeds harshness and cruelty where what is needed is softness and understanding. Anger and self-hatred also spawn harsh judgments of other black women. This judgment then leads to a competition with other black women, a contest whose reward one falsely believes can offer escape from white hatred. The invisible battle rules demand that the angry agent outdo her reflection to escape semblance as a way to escape her oppressive, inferior state. This is what Lord says. She says, we are black women, defined as never good enough. I must overcome that by becoming better than you. If I expect enough from myself, then maybe I can become different from what they say we are, different from you. If I become different enough, then maybe I won't be anymore. If I make you different enough from me, then I won't need you so much. I will become strong, the best, excel in everything, become the very best because I dare to be anything else. It is my only chance to become good enough to become human. Becoming different and better than another black woman is believed to be a ticket to the liberal conception of the human. Now, of course, this is fantastical thinking and a futile attempt at gaining recognition in a white supremacist society. But even if it wasn't futile, Lord believes that the end of white supremacy and the dawn of white approval are unable to give black women what they need. They, that is white acceptance, will never satisfy our particular black women's need for one another, says Lord, given our shared knowledge and traditions and history. Unfortunately, anger, hatred, and cruelty impedes on this togetherness. Anger born out of self-hatred creates distance between women, keeps them separate. The distance functions to make black women less like each other. It makes me less like you, makes you less me, says Lord. And it's here that she interrogates the dual potential of anger. So anger in response to outsider hate can bring outsiders and insiders closer. This is because anger sparks contestation, it demands accountability, and thus provokes contact and approach. But anger in response to insider hate or self-hatred, where the connection between them is problematic, it widens the gap between insiders. This occurs because of their unwillingness to face each other's judgments, to examine the anger. Lord believe, quote, the road to anger is paved with our unexpressed fear of each other's judgment. And this road widens their connection. But as we shall see, closeness is a cure to hatred. An examination of anger and a move towards love can counter self-hatred and offer a way for women to give each other the gift of themselves. So that was sad, and now we're going to go to some solutions so we can feel happy again. So although hatred and self-hatred are indeed strong forces, Lord does think that it's possible to find a way out of them. And she believed it is possible to break through this inherited agony, to refuse acquiescing in this bitter charade of isolation, of anger and pain. So what way out does she provide? I want to briefly highlight two remedies. So consistent with her idea that there are uses of anger as argued for in her essay bearing that name, Lord thinks that righteous fury exists and that there are many appropriate targets of such fury. Examples include those who throw dehumanizing messages at black women. And Lord is adamant that there is a distinction between hatred and anger, defining the latter as, and this is the quote that your professor has in in his book on that essay, and then nothing else is marked up in the chapter. I'm not calling you out, I'm just highlighting this. It says, a passion of displeasure that may be excessive or misplaced, but not necessarily harmful. Anger used does not destroy, hatred does. So Lorde does not change her mind about the uses of anger. Moreover, she expresses a concern for how hate can make anger go wrong. The challenge for Lorde is, how do we keep from releasing our angers at them upon ourselves and each other? So one solution that she provides is to learn to value oneself and to learn how to affirm one's own worth. And this entails first admitting that there are parts of oneself that one doesn't like, and then make friends with those parts that are both disliked and liked. It involves learning what is possible for oneself and being careful not to try to reach an impossible standard that others set to make you prove your humanity to them. It entails recognizing one's value and to value each other more, for it's only through self-recognition that one is able to recognize the worth of others who are like you. It's only by learning to love oneself that one can love others. Self-love for the Lorde is not about slogans or surface appreciation. It's about reclaiming and empowering one's present self and embracing the past self. It's about, as she writes, learning to love the stormy little black girl who once longed to be white or anything other than who she was, end quote. It's about committing to one's survival and the survival of other black women. Second, hated agents must learn to be tender. Tenderness, or what Lorde often refers to as mothering ourselves, is kindness, patience, understanding, and appreciation. It's in contrast to the harshness and cruelty that anger breeds. Being gentle with ourselves requires that a person first be gentle with themselves. Gentleness involves complimenting others and not requiring perfection from them. And Lorde suggests that we study this tenderness until it becomes a habit. Now, how might the hated be released from their angers at oppression upon themselves? As Lorde argues, the answer is found in self-worth and tenderness. Now, at first glance, this sounds like an anger management plan. Lorde is instructing black women on what they can do with their anger to make it less destructive, offering suggestions to ensure that cruel anger doesn't have the final say. And in this tradition, she falls into the ancients who also offered up anger management techniques. However, instead of viewing Lorde's solutions as anger management, I read it as a form of self-empowerment that is politically efficacious tool rather than an individualized self-help solution. Now, to more of this, recall that hatred's function for Lorde is to delimit the power of the oppressed. Lorde's solutions are not meant to manage anger, although it may have this effect. Rather, it's to resist and counter the hatred that produces the anger. These suggestions are self-empowerment tools. They are meant to give power back to the hated agent. However, we shouldn't think that this empowerment is a form of individualized self-help, as if Lorde is primarily concerned with making women feel good about themselves. On the contrary, Lorde's solutions are meant to help them survive the hatred. It's also meant to help them thrive. And this thriving outcome can obtain because the solutions give black women what they need to survive and thrive in a racist and sexist world: each other. This includes support, communication, bonding, healing of each other's wounds, which all can be summed up as, for Lorde, the power of black sisterhood. Now, the intervention that Lorde is making in Eye to Eye, on my view, is in providing a self-empowerment blueprint that is politically useful to attack the social and psychological forces meant to make black women powerless. And she is helping women move beyond the numb conception of survival to the erotic-infused kind where sisterhood and coalitions can be built. While popular self-help often guarantees quick results, Lorde admits that the process towards overcoming the hatred and the anger and connecting despite the hatred will be lengthy and difficult. However, she believes that it is indeed possible. So, in the case for rage, I defend anger at racism and racists. And I call it Lordean rage, inspired by Audre Lorde's account of anger in the essay, Uses of Anger. Lordean rage, in my view, is an anti-racist anger that is essential to struggles against racism because it advertises justice worth, as well as the targets of injustice. It motivates political action, and it breaks racial rules meant to sustain white supremacy by determining how oppressed groups should feel, think, and behave. However, the essay Eye to Eye suggests that it's not enough to have Lordean rage if one also has anger spawned by self-hatred, and thus has yet to obtain the solidarity and togetherness with those who, quote, bears the face that hatred seeks. So, here's a question. Can Lordean rage sustain the hated agent? Lorde provides some insights. First, Lorde notes that anti-racist anger in response to hatred can keep the oppressed alive. It's more useful than the hatred that it responds to, and it can clarify differences. However, she recognizes that strength that is bred by anger alone is a blind force, which cannot create the future. Such strength does not focus upon what lies ahead, but upon what lies behind, upon what created it, hatred. Lorde's focus in the passage is on the solidarity and strength that anti-racist anger can create. And she thinks that anger at the oppressor is not enough to bind and strengthen the oppressed, no matter how useful it is for fighting powerful, oppressive outsiders. And Eye to Eye, Lorde gives us the resources to make up for this lack. Lorde also recognizes that engages in anti-racist anger to fight hate is not enough to give hated agents the power that hatred seeks to restrict. They need something more. She writes, and political work will not save our souls, no matter how correct and necessary that work is. Yet, it is true that without political work, we cannot hope to survive long enough to effect any change. And self-empowerment is the most deeply political work there is and the most difficult. Anti-racist anger allows resistors to engage in political work that gives them a chance at survival. But it's only when they let go of self-hatred and the anger it engenders and embrace tenderness, self-love, and self-worth can they then regain their power, which is hatred's true target, and the embrace of each other. Only in doing so are they able to save their souls. This is the empowerment that Lorde defends. And this is not to say that political work as well as political emotions are not important or necessary. Rather, it's to suggest that political freedoms and negative political emotions are not sufficient for full liberation. More is needed, like love, empathy, solidarity, togetherness, and tenderness among community members. It's difficult work, but it's the most deeply political work there is. So anti-Black racism, misogyny, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Asian hate, and I can go on, are on the rise in the Western world. Many have been emboldened to express hatred in ways that would have been looked down upon a few years ago. And it's for this reason that many have given attention to the hatred phenomenon. But it's not enough to only analyze group hatred, racial hatred, or hate speech. Hatred has an afterlife, what Lorde refers to as self-hatred, anger, and cruelty. And if we do not examine and seek to remedy them, then even when all the races and sexes hate disappears, hate will remain as powerless people lay in its wake. Audre Lorde draws our attention to how self-hatred manifests and how it fuels a distinct kind of anger and cruelty. And she challenges us to engage in the important work of working on ourselves and each other to combat it. I think that we would be wise to heed her recommendations or witness the alternative. Power and connection extracted from the lives of those who need them the most. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I have the microphone for questions and comments for Professor Cherry. So I will play the Sally Jesse Raphael. Not many people will know that reference, and
They
run
don't know
around with
that
the microphone.
reference.
So who would like to ask a question or make a comment? And don't be shy. Once somebody's got to break the ice. Karina, I knew you.
How do you recommend that we use rage in community organizing?
Yeah. And so I think one of the things I think that this talk kinds of motivate, and also with the first chapter of my book, The Case for Rage Motivate, is for us to try to figure out what kind of rage we're talking about. And so in my book, for example, I talk about, hey, there's so many different kind of angers that can arise in the context of what one take to be a political injustice. And there's a way that we can figure out what is which, because they all kind of have certain kind of distinct features about them. And then the anger that I'm talking about today is none of those types, right? It's not in response to a political injustice or in response to what one takes to be the oppressor. It's in response to the oppressed. It's in response to fellow victims of political injustice. And so what I'm arguing is that if it's that kind of anger, right? So if the anger that you have in community organizing is directed to another community organizers for reasons of internalizing the hatred that Audre Lorde speaks to, then the recommendations that I kind of laid out, and some that I kind of did not for the sake of time, such as examining and analyzing one's emotions, is important. And I want to say that as much as my account of Lordean rage, I suggest that is useful. This kind of anger that she's talking about that arises out of self-hatred is not useful. So it's important for us to examine it, tackle it, and heed the solutions that she's offering. But if it's the rage of Lordean rage that I make a whole case for the book, the suggestions that I use, motivating the very last chapter of that book, is to suggest, hey, if you have Lordean rage, which is directed at racism, racist structures, you want, change, transformation of a better world as a result of that. You understand that, you are not free until everybody else is free. Then, kind of use that rage to motivate you to fight against the injustice. But if it's the rage of participants at the Capitol, that's not useful in the sense of building up a better democracy for us all. And we want to make sure that we examine that. And as someone who's in solidarity with, with each other, if you recognize that another fellow member has what I'm calling kind of a destructive kind of rage, that we hold them accountable, that we try to usher them into more positive aspects of it. Now, mind you, I didn't say anger management in the sense of getting rid of the anger, because I think, anger is useful, but a distinct kind. And identifying what kinds of rage are in the movements would be important to then trying to figure out what to do with it next. Yeah.
I hope this is phrased well, but if you're under the impression that you've met or come into contact with someone who feels this deep hatred in their heart, I've been in a position where I've tried to get through to them and it just hasn't worked. And I was curious if, through your understanding of Audre Lorde, if there is some recommended path to getting through to someone who seems like they've indulged in hatred almost as like a self-defense mechanism, like they don't want to examine themselves deeper, so they just allow themselves to believe it. Yeah.
I want you to say a little bit more about who is the agent who has the self-hatred and who has the hatred and who is it directed at?
In this instance, it was my brother had a friend who visited us from online, and they were expressing anti-Semitism.
I see.
Yeah, and I was trying to explain to them all their evidence was just anecdotes and things they'd been told by people who wouldn't know any better. And so I tried to approach it with love and say, you're putting hatred in the world and all this, and they just wouldn't get through to them because they had entrenched their identity so deeply in the anti-Semitism that they wouldn't accept any other alternative. So I was just curious if there's some recommendation of how can you get through to someone who has made part of their identity the hatred to the point where they just won't hear any alternatives.
It's an interesting question. It's a difficult question to answer. So I'm going to do it the intellectual historian way, which I realize is a good way to answer questions. It really helps you, dodge certain kinds of questions. I'm a philosopher in real life, but this intellectual historian really helps. Okay. So I would say, how Audre Lorde answered that question. So Audre Lorde would say, and you get a sense of this throughout her essays, if you read Sister Outsider. Her emphasis, her focus in her work was not necessarily people like your friend or like your brother's friend. She was more concerned about what happens to the individual that internalizes the hatred that that person is spewing on them. And her work and her efforts, her creative efforts, her activist work, her intellectual efforts, was geared to helping oppressed people release themselves from the self-hatred that comes out of hatred. And I think the solutions that she provides addresses that. Now, one might say, well, is it possible for us to use some of the solutions that we've laid out today in the context of the oppressed feeling self-hatred? Could those work for a person who has hatred towards groups? Perhaps. But I'll also say I think there's a variety of sources from black political thinkers, but also white thinkers who were actually involved in kind of hate movements, who have found a way out of them, who does offer up a way for those individuals who are still stuck in them. And this is where the wonderful thing about, people think that black people have all the answers. And it kind of reminds me of a famous quote by Toni Morrison that she's in an interview, I forgot who it was, and she says, white people suffer from a profound neurosis. And she was like, if you have to make someone feel small in order for you to feel tall, that's just tragic. And she says, and white people need to figure out what they can do about that. And here's the good thing. There are white people who have figured out what to do about that. And I would suggest kind of throwing some of that PDF file in the email or the book, because there are people who can testify that's going across the country talking to people who lived. I think it's a recent book that just came out, or a profile of an individual who was raised in a Nazi movement. And then he goes to college and things changes for him, and he kind of talks about how what happened. And I think that would be more of a resource. But Audre Lorde is like, I'm gonna talk to, this is my audience, let me help them, and y'all can help the brethren. And that's why all of our work is important.
Hello, thank you for being here. Hello, yeah. Thank you for being here. Really, really appreciated the talk. I regret that I have not read the book yet, but I certainly want to, especially now. But I just wanted to ask a question. Maybe this is sort of opening a door, but I'd love to have your reflections on how, right now, it seems there's a sort of, I would call it some kind of a movement or current afoot, where people are saying, well, you know, the problem with this anger is that it's holding up a mirror to particularly white folks. And now they're being forced, they're starting to engage in a sort of self-hatred, you know, because they don't like what they see. But the response seems to be not some of the things that you've suggested in terms of construction and learning and moving forward. And maybe this plays on your work on forgiveness, but the response seems to be to double down on ignorance. In other words, let's protect them from having to look into that mirror, right? So I don't know, do you have some thoughts about how to approach that or respond to that kind of reaction?
That diagnosis is interesting. And I wonder what you think about this. Is it proper for us to call it self-hatred? Could it be shame? Could it be guilt? What do you think about that? I just find the, I don't know if I'm convinced that it's the self-hatred. It's self-hatred.
No, I agree. Actually, I agree. I think that's a good clarification. But I think they perceive it in that way, or as a way of having to make themselves hate themselves. The folks that feel this way, because I think that it's, I mean, there's a lot to be said about the fact that you've got a group of people who have never had to confront themselves in that way. They're not used to being confronted with that kind of mirror, right? And so I think that is their understanding of the response. I mean, of their own response and of what's being asked of them. You know, and I'm thinking about things like, you know, the way that where people are talking about we shouldn't teach history this way, you know, or we shouldn't have these books.
This is good.
Or,
Okay, yeah. So I think, and this is going to be a strong claim, I think that we confuse shame and guilt, which are moral emotions that have a role to play in transforming our behavior. We confuse it with self-hatred. And given the confusion, it's easy to advocate against the thing that led you to the shame and guilt by suggesting that it leads to self-hatred. Let me say it in a more easier way. If I'm confusing the shame and guilt with self-hatred, then of course I'm going to try to prevent anyone from analyzing themselves if it's going to lead to that. And so what you do in order to make sure that doesn't happen is you say, hey, this thing is making our kids hate themselves because they're being taught this. And as a moral psychologist who believe that emotional intelligence is very, very important, not just understanding what we feel ourselves, but also understanding what other people feel, it's important that you identify the actual emotion that you feel. And I think you can confuse it with self-hatred all you want, but if we lay out the features, then it's much more aligned with shame and guilt. And shame and guilt, we might say it may feel like self-hatred because you feel like hiding. You know, it may have the intensity of kind of similarities as far as affect with self-hatred. But I think what's really going on is the shame and guilt. And I think what needs to happen, as opposed to confusing it with self-hatred, which is going to lead us to no work or no progress at all, to sit with the guilt, to sit with the shame, and allow those more emotions to do the kind of thing that's going to allow us to analyze, examine, and improve our lives. And just as Audre Lorde suggests when it comes to, you know, oppressed people, in this case, it's also lengthy and difficult, but it's needed. It's needed. That's why people are trying to prevent it from happening. Right.
In your work or in your thinking, how does ignorance and lack of education tie into hatred and like kind of like unjustified hatred?
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out what day it is. I've been sick for like 2 weeks, so like 3 weeks ago just seemed like 12 hours ago to me. But someone had brought that kind of to my attention just yesterday. It was yesterday. And kind of a similar question. And one of the things that I suggest is, one of the roles of anger is to bring our attention to injustice, right? It simply says something is going wrong in a moral community, right? So it's a response to injustice, it's a response to something is wrong in the world. Okay. And in kind of bringing recognition to injustice, that if you witness someone angry, that should also bring your attention to the thing that they're responding to or they're angry about, which is the injustice. And it's so fascinating in our era that given all, this is the information age with the internet, with TikTok, everybody shares their business, share their thoughts, share their opinions, which is annoying to me, but I watch anyway. We just know so much. And it's just so strange to me that people don't know that racism or sexism or all this stuff exists. You just have to convince me that people are truly ignorant. There's no doubt that people are willfully ignorant. What is also fascinating to me is that people can witness angry people or recognize angry people, but fail to recognize the injustice that they're responding to. And in order for that to happen, you have to deceive yourself and be so willfully ignorant that you bypass that whole thing. So I don't buy ignorant simpliciter. I do understand that there's a such thing as willful ignorance, right? Refusing to know anything or refusing to go deeper to understand others. And this is something that James Baldwin as well as Charles Mills exemplified in their work. And what Baldwin was very much concerned about is what does it take to get white people to face what they willfully have decided not to face. That too is hard work, right? And we understand it just as human beings, in our day-to-day interactions. Trying to come to the truth about who we are every day is like, oh God, okay, I am a procrastinator. I mean, it takes a long time for you to admit who you really are. And to face it, to get better. If that's already difficult when we're the only person at stake, you can imagine how difficult when it comes to other kind of more social at-scale things. But it's the willful ignorance that's the problem. And you gotta face it, gotta put in the effort in order to do so. Particularly with AI, I mean, it's like we got all these inventions and people are still saying, I didn't know that racism still exists.
So we did a reading beforehand, and I just had a quote that really stuck out to me, and I was just wondering if you could channel Lorde and expand on it, because I've been thinking about it.
I'm just
The quote says, "It is the hatred which lurks in those streets that urge to destroy us all if we truly work for change rather than merely indulge in academic rhetoric."
Read it again for us.
"It is the hatred which lurks in those streets that urge to destroy us all if we truly work for change rather than merely indulge in academic rhetoric."
Yeah. So there's one of the lines that she says at the very end of Uses of Anger, where she says, people are afraid of our anger, but they should really be afraid of bombs being dropped on innocent people, or they really should be afraid of, catastrophes that's happening in the world. Like, our anger is not the thing that you should be angry about. And when you think about the hatred that exists, as I kind of illuminated, in which self-hatred responds to, is lurking, and it does have the potential to destroy, as we see kind of policies that come out of that, and people's lives in the present and the future is being affected by hatred, no doubt. You want me to say something controversial? It's interesting here because given the reality of hatred that seeks to destroy people, The question is, what are we going to do about it? Read that the second clause of that.
The urge to destroy us all if we truly work for change rather than merely indulge in academic rhetoric.
Say it again. I come from a Christian background. This is what we do in church. Say it. Read again.
The urge to destroy us all if we truly work for change rather than merely indulge in academic rhetoric.
Yeah. And it's like, in order to defeat the hatred, I mean, we actually got to work for it. And the question is, what are the ways that we can work in order to escape it, in order to defeat it? And for Lorde, it's like, I mean, she had a tendency, I mean, she did, she worked, I mean, she was a teacher, she did work in academia. But she was also an activist. And one of the reasons why she was resistant to theory is that she just felt like, I mean, she knew, as we know who are in academia, you can get so caught up in phrasing a thing, describing a thing, that you're not in the trenches trying to change a thing. And that's one of the reasons why she resisted the term theorist, right? And she considered herself, much more than an academic. And there's, of course, limits to what an academic could do. But I think, just like her life exemplified, that you can really work for change and be an academic. And, one of the things I'm trying to do through my work is to use my work to work for change. Just like her work has helped a lot of people. She has changed a lot of people's lives and have led them to also work for change. But not everybody should be an academic, and there's a variety of ways to do it. And I think the cautionary tale that no matter what we do, that we don't get caught up in doing the thing, that we forget what we're doing it for. And theory is supposed to illuminate so that people can see things and so they can therefore change it. And sometimes we can get caught up in just creating a thing so that people can see us rather than seeing a way forward. And I'm about to go on a tangent, and I'm going to stop just right there. Thank you for that.
These questions are on one side or the other. I'm getting my steps in. Thank you for getting me some exercise.
Hi. You used a term a little bit ago, and I think it was counter-rage. And I'm just curious if you could expand on that. Or maybe I misheard that.
I didn't use counter-rage.
Okay.
But, there's a search function on this iPad.
I was like, that's an interesting concept.
Let me see here. Also, I got a cold, so it could have been anything really. Let's see. Nothing's coming up.
Not a thing.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I was just curious about that because I was like, oh, I think sometimes like the energy that we put into things comes out of them. So it's like if we're countering the rage, like using rage, like flipping it on its head and like still having that same like really intense energy, but in a positive direction, that could be really
There's
useful.
an account. You just gave an account of.
Yeah.
I like that.
All right.
As long as it's not the counter anger that comes from self-hatred.
Right.
Because then we just end up in an endless loop of cruelty.
More of the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Any other questions in the room? Well, the conversation does not stop here. We have the food and drink over there, and we can head over and continue the conversation with Professor Cherry. Please join me in thanking her for a wonderful talk.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for your wonderful questions, and Lakers in 6.